The morning sun cast long shadows across the Afghan valley as the convoy rolled through the dusty terrain. Staff Sergeant Marcus "Tank" Rodriguez adjusted his grip on his M4 carbine and scanned the rocky outcrops ahead. The weight of responsibility pressed down on his shoulders like the heavy tactical gear he wore. His team of 8 Navy SEALs had been tasked with establishing a forward medical station in one of the most dangerous regions of Helmand Province. "Movement ahead, 2 clicks," called out Petty Officer Second Class Danny Chun from the lead vehicle. His voice crackled through the radio with practiced calm, but Tank could hear the underlying tension. They all felt it. This mission was different from their usual direct action rates. Today, they were playing escort to medical personnel, and Tank wasn't entirely comfortable with the change in pace. The convoy consisted of 3 armored vehicles carrying the SEAL team, medical supplies, and their precious cargo, a team of Navy medical personnel who would staff the forward station. Tank glanced back at the middle vehicle where the medical team rode. He'd been briefed on their qualifications, but, in his mind, they were still civilians who needed protection. The thought of babysitting doctors and nurses in a combat zone didn't sit well with him or his team. "Tank, we've got civilians to protect," reminded Lieutenant Commander Sarah Mitchell, the team's commanding officer, through his earpiece. She was riding in the rear vehicle, coordinating with command back at base. "These medical personnel are essential to the mission. Without them, we can't establish the aid station that'll support future operations in this sector." Rodriguez keyed his mic. "Copy that, ma'am. We'll keep the medical team safe." He meant it, but part of him wondered why they couldn't just bring military medics instead of what he assumed were soft hospital staff who'd never seen combat. In the middle vehicle, Hospital Corpsman First Class Elena Vasquez sat quietly among the medical supplies, her medical bag secured between her boots. The 28-year-old Navy nurse had been handpicked for this assignment, though the SEALs didn't know why. To them, she appeared to be just another medical officer, someone who spent their days in sterile hospital wards treating routine injuries and illnesses. Elena kept her expression neutral as she listened to the radio chatter. She could sense the team's reluctance about working with medical personnel. It was nothing new. In her 8 years of Navy service, she'd encountered this attitude before. Combat troops often viewed medical staff as liabilities in the field, people who needed protection rather than assets who could contribute to mission success. What the SEAL team didn't know was that Elena's background was far more complex than her current assignment suggested. Before becoming a nurse, she had served 4 years as a hospital corpsman attached to Marine units. She'd completed advanced combat training, earned her marksman qualification, and had deployed twice to Iraq during some of the heaviest fighting. Her transition to nursing had been a career move to advance her medical skills, but she'd never lost the edge that came from operating in hostile territory. The convoy slowed as they approached a narrow pass between 2 rocky hills. Tank felt his pulse quicken. This was exactly the kind of terrain where insurgents liked to stage ambushes. The steep slopes on either side provided perfect cover for enemy fighters, and the narrow road gave the convoy limited maneuvering options. "Overwatch, this is Ground Team Alpha." Tank radioed to their air support. "We're entering the canyon pass now. Request you maintain close surveillance on the ridgelines." "Copy, Ground Team Alpha. We have eyes on your position. No movement detected at this time, but we'll keep watching." The vehicles moved slowly through the pass, their engines echoing off the rocky walls. Tank's team maintained alert positions, weapons ready, scanning for any sign of threat. The medical personnel in the middle vehicle remained quiet, following instructions to stay low and avoid unnecessary movement. Elena studied the terrain through the small window of her vehicle. Her trained eye picked up details that worried her: fresh tire tracks in the sand, disturbed rocks on the slopes that suggested recent foot traffic, and the complete absence of local civilians who would normally be found in this area. Every instinct told her that trouble was coming. "Driver, slow down," she called to the SEAL operating their vehicle. "Something doesn't feel right." Petty Officer First Class Jake Morrison, who was driving, glanced back at her with surprise. "Ma'am, we need to maintain convoy speed. Tank's got this under control." Elena bit back her response. She had spotted several indicators that suggested an ambush setup, but she knew the SEALs wouldn't welcome tactical advice from someone they viewed as a non-combatant. Instead, She quietly adjusted her position to have better access to her medical bag and checked that her sidearm was secure in its holster. The convoy was halfway through the pass when Tank's worst fears materialized. The sharp crack of rifle fire echoed through the canyon, followed immediately by the distinctive whistle of incoming rocket-propelled grenades. Tank's training took over instantly. Contact! Contact! RPG incoming from the North Ridge, he shouted into his radio as he spotted muzzle flashes among the rocks above them. All vehicles, execute immediate action drill. The lead vehicle accelerated rapidly, trying to clear the kill zone, while the rear vehicle began laying down suppressive fire on the enemy positions. Tank's vehicle, carrying the medical team, found itself trapped in the middle of the ambush. Bullets pinged off the armored hull as Morrison fought to keep the vehicle moving forward. In the back of the vehicle, Elena felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that she remembered from her deployments with the Marines. The other medical personnel were understandably terrified, pressing themselves low against the floor of the vehicle. But Elena's combat experience kicked in automatically. She began conducting a rapid assessment of their situation and planning for what might come next. Medical team, sound off. Tank called back to them as gunfire intensified around their position. All medical personnel accounted for. Elena responded, her voice steady and professional. The other members of the medical team looked at her with surprise. They had expected panic, but Elena sounded as calm as any of the SEALs. An RPG struck the ground just meters from their vehicle, the explosion rocking them violently. Morrison struggled to maintain control as debris rained down on them. Through his headset, Tank could hear Lieutenant Commander Mitchell coordinating with air support and the other vehicles. Ground Team Alpha, this is Overwatch. We have multiple enemy positions on both ridges. Count approximately 15 to 20 fighters. We're engaging with Hellfire missiles, but you need to get out of that kill zone. Tank assessed their situation rapidly. The lead vehicle had made it through and was setting up a support position. The rear vehicle was laying down covering fire, but couldn't advance due to the intensity of enemy fire. His vehicle, with the medical team, was pinned down in the most dangerous part of the canyon. Morrison, can you punch it through? Tank asked. Negative. There's an improvised barrier ahead. Looks like they dropped rocks across the road. We're stuck until someone can clear it. Tank realized they were in serious trouble. The enemy had planned this ambush well, using the terrain and obstacles to trap the convoy in a deadly crossfire. His team would need to dismount and fight their way to better positions, but that would mean leaving the medical personnel vulnerable in the vehicle. Another RPG impacted nearby, this one close enough to spiderweb the vehicle's bulletproof windows. Tank made a hard decision. Medical team, we're going to have to move on foot. When I give the word, you follow Petty Officer Morrison to those rocks over there. Stay low and move fast. Elena quickly assessed the route Tank was indicating. It was about 30 meters to a cluster of boulders that would provide good cover, but the path was completely exposed to enemy fire from the ridges. The other medical personnel looked terrified at the prospect of leaving their armored vehicle. Sir, Elena called to Tank. What about suppressing fire? We'll need cover to make that movement. Tank looked back at her with surprise. Her question showed tactical thinking that he hadn't expected from a nurse. Chun and Williams will provide cover fire. Johnson and I will bound forward with you. Once we reach those rocks, we'll reassess. The plan was straightforward, but dangerous. Elena could see that Tank was doing his best with a bad situation, but she also noticed something he might have missed. The boulder cluster he'd chosen for cover had a dead space behind it that would be vulnerable to enemy fire from the southern ridge. It was a good initial position, but they'd need to move again quickly. Ready? Tank called out as his team prepared to dismount. Elena took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her medical bag and the familiar presence of her sidearm. Ready? Morrison threw open the vehicle's rear door, and immediately the sound of gunfire became much louder. Tank's team moved with practiced efficiency, establishing firing positions around the vehicle and beginning to return fire at the enemy positions. The distinctive sound of M4 rifles mixed with the enemy's AK-47s in a deadly symphony that echoed through the canyon. Move, Tank shouted, and the group sprinted toward the rocks. Elena ran hard, keeping pace with the SEALs and maintaining awareness of the other medical personnel. Bullets cracked overhead and kicked up dust around their feet as they covered the distance. She could hear the steady pop-pop-pop of covering fire from Chun and Williams, who were doing their best to keep enemy heads down. They reached the rocks just as an RPG streaked overhead, impacting the canyon wall behind them. Tank immediately began coordinating with his other team members, trying to develop a plan to break contact and continue the mission. But Elena was studying the enemy positions with the eye of someone who had been in similar situations before. From her new vantage point, she could see muzzle flashes from at least 3 different positions on the north ridge and 2 on the south. The enemy fighters were well-positioned and disciplined, maintaining good fire control and not exposing themselves unnecessarily. This wasn't a ragtag group of insurgents. They were facing experienced fighters who had planned this ambush carefully. Tank, Elena called out during a brief lull in the firing. The southern position has overwatch on this location. We need to move again soon, or they'll flank us. Tank looked at her with increased interest. Her observation was accurate, and it showed a level of tactical awareness he hadn't expected. You're right. But we need to neutralize at least one of those positions before we can advance. Elena studied the terrain and the enemy positions for a moment longer. An idea was forming in her mind, based on her experience with Marine units who had faced similar situations. But she knew Tank wouldn't welcome unsolicited tactical advice from someone he viewed as a non-combatant. The firefight continued to intensify around them as Elena wrestled with a decision that would change everything about how the SEAL team viewed her. The mission was in jeopardy, American lives were at stake, and she had knowledge and skills that could help. The question was whether to reveal her true capabilities or continue to let the SEALs handle the situation their way. As bullets continued to crack overhead and RPGs exploded around their position, Elena realized that the time for maintaining her cover as just a nurse might be running out. The next few minutes would determine whether the mission succeeded or failed, and whether everyone made it home alive. The explosion from the latest RPG showered the group with rock fragments and dust. Tank wiped debris from his eyes and keyed his radio, trying to reach Lieutenant Commander Mitchell in the rear vehicle. Static mixed with gunfire made communication difficult, but he could make out enough to know that air support was still several minutes away from being able to engage effectively. Chun, Williams, what's your ammo status? Tank called to his team members who were still providing covering fire from the disabled vehicle. Running low on rifle ammo. Chun responded. Maybe 2 magazines left. Williams is down to his last mag. Tank cursed under his breath. The ambush had been perfectly planned, and his team was burning through ammunition faster than he'd anticipated. They needed to break contact soon or risk being overrun when their fire superiority diminished. Elena listened to the radio traffic while keeping her head down behind the rocks. She could hear the strain in Tank's voice and recognized the tactical problems they were facing. The SEAL team was highly trained and competent, but they were dealing with a situation that required specific expertise in mountain warfare and ambush tactics, expertise that she happened to possess from her time with Marine units in similar terrain. Another burst of automatic fire raked their position, forcing everyone to press themselves lower against the rocks. Elena noticed that one of the other medical personnel, a young Navy nurse named Petty Officer Collins, was starting to show signs of panic. Her breathing was rapid and shallow, and her hands were shaking badly. Collins, Elena said quietly, moving closer to the younger nurse. Look at me. You're going to be fine. Focus on your breathing. In through your nose, out through your mouth. That's it. Collins nodded, trying to follow Elena's instructions. The other medical personnel seemed to take comfort from Elena's calm demeanor, clustering closer to her as the firefight raged around them. Tank noticed the interaction and felt a moment of gratitude. At least the senior nurse was keeping the other medical staff calm. He had enough problems without dealing with panicked civilians. But he also noticed something else about Elena's behavior. She wasn't cowering in fear like he'd expected. Instead, she was methodically scanning the enemy positions and studying the terrain with the focused attention of someone who understood combat. Morrison, Tank called to his driver, who had taken a position behind a large boulder. Can you get eyes on the southern ridge? I think they're moving fighters to flank us. Morrison adjusted his position and raised his rifle scope. After a moment, he confirmed Tank's suspicion. Affirmative. I count at least 3 fighters moving along the ridge line, heading toward our 6 o'clock position. Elena had been watching the same movement. From her experience with Marine reconnaissance units, she recognized the classic flanking maneuver. The enemy was trying to get behind their position to eliminate their escape route and establish a crossfire that would be devastating. But she also saw something that Tank's team had missed, a weakness in the enemy's plan. The fighters moving along the southern ridge had to cross a narrow, exposed section where the rock formation dipped lower. It was only about a 20-meter stretch, but for maybe 30 seconds, they would be visible and vulnerable to accurate rifle fire. The problem was that none of Tank's current positions had a clear shot at that location. Elena looked at her sidearm, a standard Navy-issued M9 pistol. It was adequate for close-range self-defense, but useless for the long-range precision shot that the situation required. However, she noticed that Chun, who was still at the vehicle, had what appeared to be an M14 enhanced battle rifle slung across his back along with his primary weapon. She made a decision that would change everything. "Tank," Elena called out, her voice cutting through the noise of gunfire with an authority that made the SEAL team leader look at her sharply. "I need to borrow a rifle." "Ma'am, you need to stay down and let us handle this," Tank responded automatically, but something in Elena's tone made him pause. "Those fighters on the south ridge are going to flank us in about 2 minutes, Elena said, pointing to the enemy movement. "They have to cross an exposed section right there. It's a clean shot, but none of your current positions have the angle." Tank followed her gaze and immediately understood what she was seeing. His tactical experience confirmed her assessment. They were about to be caught in a deadly crossfire. But the solution she was suggesting seemed impossible. "Ma'am, with respect, that's a difficult shot even for trained marksmen. The range is at least 400 meters, and I can make the shot," Elena interrupted, her voice steady and confident. "But I need Chin's M14 and about 30 seconds to get into position." Tank stared at her for a moment, trying to process what he was hearing. The quiet Navy nurse was suddenly speaking with the confidence of an experienced sniper, making tactical assessments that matched his own, and volunteering for what was essentially a combat mission. Another RPG exploded nearby, close enough to rain debris down on their position. Tank could hear his team's rifles beginning to slow their rate of fire as ammunition ran low. He was rapidly running out of options, and the flanking movement Elena had identified was about to turn their defensive position into a death trap. "Ma'am, I need to know, do you have combat experience?" Tank asked directly. Elena met his eyes steadily. "For years as a Marine-attached hospital corpsman. 2 deployments to Iraq. Advanced combat training graduate. Expert marksman qualification." She paused, then added, "I can make this shot, but we're running out of time." Tank's mind raced. Elena's claimed qualifications would explain her tactical awareness and calm under fire, but it seemed impossible that such an experienced combat veteran had been assigned to his mission without his knowledge. Then, again, the Navy's personnel system was complex, and medical personnel often had backgrounds that weren't immediately obvious from their current assignments. "Chun," Tank called out, "pass me your M14. Chun looked confused but immediately complied, sprinting from the vehicle to Tank's position while bullets cracked overhead. He handed over the rifle along with several magazines of .308 ammunition. Tank examined Elena's face one more time, looking for any sign of doubt or hesitation. What he saw was the steady gaze of someone who had been in combat before and knew exactly what they were capable of. It was a look he recognized in his most experienced team members. "You'll have one chance," Tank said, handing her the rifle. "If you miss, they'll spot your muzzle flash and concentrate fire on your position." Elena accepted the weapon with the smooth efficiency of someone who had handled rifles extensively. She quickly checked the chamber, tested the bolt action, and examined the scope's zero. "What's the last confirmed zero on this scope?" she asked Chun. 200 meters, last week at the range," Chun replied, clearly puzzled by the interaction he was witnessing. Elena nodded and made rapid mental calculations for bullet drop at the increased range. She identified a shooting position about 10 meters to their left, where a gap between rocks would give her the angle she needed on the exposed section of ridge. "I'm moving to that position," she told Tank, pointing to the location. Give me covering fire when I move. Then, watch for my muzzle flash. When I take the shot, be ready to engage any other targets that present themselves. Tank found himself nodding automatically. Elena was giving tactical instructions with the confidence and competence of a seasoned operator. Her transformation from quiet nurse to combat professional was so complete that he was beginning to question everything he thought he knew about the medical team. Chun, Williams, when the nurse moves, lay down heavy covering fire on the North Ridge positions. Morrison, keep eyes on the flanking movement and call out ranges. Elena took several deep breaths, mentally preparing for what she was about to do. It had been over 3 years since she'd fired a rifle in combat, but the skills came back instantly. She could feel her heart rate slowing as she entered the focused mental state that had made her an expert marksman during her Marine deployments. Ready, she announced. Go. Elena sprinted from cover toward her chosen firing position as Chun and Williams opened up with sustained automatic fire on the enemy positions. Bullets snapped past her as she ran, but the covering fire was effective in keeping enemy heads down. She reached the gap between rocks and immediately assumed a prone firing position, settling the rifle into her shoulder with practiced ease. Through the scope, she could see the section of ridge where the enemy fighters would have to cross. Morrison's voice crackled through Tank's radio with range updates. Flanking element is 200 meters from the crossing point, 100 meters, 50 meters. Elena controlled her breathing and settled the crosshairs on the exact spot where the enemy fighters would appear. The rifle felt familiar in her hands despite the years since she'd used one in combat. Her finger found the trigger, and she applied just enough pressure to take up the slack without firing. First target approaching the crossing point, Morrison called out. Elena saw movement in her scope as the lead enemy fighter appeared in the gap. He was moving quickly, clearly aware that he would be exposed, but confident that the Americans didn't have a shot from their current positions. Elena led him slightly, accounting for his movement and the bullet's travel time. She fired. The .308 round struck the enemy fighter's center mass, dropping him instantly. The sharp crack of the rifle echoed through the canyon, and Elena immediately worked the bolt to chamber another round. Target down, she called out calmly. Second fighter approaching. The second enemy fighter appeared in the gap, this time moving even faster after seeing his comrade fall. But Elena was ready. She tracked him smoothly and fired again. Another hit. The third fighter, seeing what had happened to his companions, tried to turn back, but Elena's third shot caught him before he could reach cover. All targets neutralized, Elena announced, working the bolt one more time and scanning for additional threats. Tank stared at her position in amazement. In less than 15 seconds, Elena had eliminated the entire flanking element with 3 precise shots at extreme range. The accuracy and speed of engagement would have been impressive from any of his team members, but from someone he'd thought was a non-combatant, it was extraordinary. Outstanding shooting, Tank called out. Return to cover. Elena sprinted back to the main group as the enemy fire from the remaining positions intensified. The elimination of the flanking element had clearly frustrated the ambush plan, and the enemy was becoming more aggressive in their attacks on the primary position. As Elena settled back behind the rocks, she handed the M14 back to Chun. Thanks for the loan, she said simply. Chun took the rifle with a look of profound confusion. Ma'am, where did you learn to shoot like that? Elena looked at Tank, who was studying her with new respect and considerable curiosity. She realized that her cover was completely blown now. There was no way to pretend to be just a nurse after demonstrating sniper-level marksmanship in combat. Long story, she said. Maybe we should focus on getting out of here first. Tank nodded, but Elena could see that he was reassessing everything about the situation. The radio crackled with an update from Lieutenant Commander Mitchell. Air support is 30 seconds out. Mark your positions and prepare for danger close fire missions. Elena looked up at the enemy positions on the ridges and then back at Tank. After air support neutralizes the main positions, they're going to try to break contact and withdraw. If we move fast, we can cut off their escape route and finish this. Tank's eyebrows rose. Elena wasn't just offering tactical advice now. She was essentially taking initiative in planning their assault. And her assessment was probably correct. What do you have in mind? Tank asked. Elena pointed to a series of rock formations that would allow flanking movement on the enemy positions. If we can get a team up that slope, we can hit them from behind while they're focused on the airstrikes. They'll be trapped between us and the aircraft. It was a sound tactical plan, but it would require Elena to continue in a combat role rather than remaining with the other medical personnel. Tank found himself facing a decision he'd never expected to make, whether to trust a Navy nurse to function as a combat operator in an assault mission. The thunder of approaching aircraft filled the canyon as Tank looked at Elena one more time. Everything about her demeanor and capabilities suggested that she was far more than she appeared to be. But integrating her into active combat operations would be a significant departure from standard procedures. Elena, Tank said, using her first name for the first time. Who exactly are you? Elena met his gaze steadily. Right now, I'm whoever you need me to be to complete this mission and get everyone home safely. The roar of jet engines filled the canyon as two F/A-18 Super Hornets screamed overhead. Tank quickly coordinated with the air support, marking enemy positions with an infrared laser that would be visible to the pilots through their targeting systems. Blackbird Flight, this is Ground Team Alpha. We have multiple enemy positions marked on both ridgelines. Request danger close fire missions. Over. Ground Team Alpha, Blackbird Flight. We have your marks. Confirm you are at least 100 meters from target areas. Tank looked around at their position and made rapid calculations. They were close to the minimum safe distance, but the rock formations would provide adequate protection from the blast effects. Confirmed, Blackbird Flight. We are in safe positions. You are cleared hot. Elena watched the aircraft circle back for their attack runs while keeping one eye on the enemy positions. She could see muzzle flashes from the fighters who were still engaging Tank's team, but their rate of fire had decreased significantly. They were probably conserving ammunition, which suggested they were planning to break contact soon. Tank, Elena called out. After the airstrikes, the survivors are going to try to exfiltrate down the backside of those ridges. There's a wadi system that connects to the main road about 2 kilometers east. If they reach it, they'll disappear into the local population. Tank studied the terrain where Elena was pointing. Her assessment matched his own knowledge of insurgent tactics in this region. Enemy fighters often used the dry creek beds as escape routes because they provided concealment from aerial observation and connected to larger population centers where they could blend in. How do you know about the wadi system? Tank asked. Studied the terrain maps during mission planning, Elena replied. Plus, it's standard insurgent procedure in this type of terrain. I've seen it before. The first air strike hit the northern ridge with devastating precision. The explosion echoed through the canyon as rocks and debris rained down from the impact site. Almost immediately, the enemy fire from that position ceased entirely. Good hits on the north ridge, Tank radioed to the aircraft. Shift fire to southern positions. The second strike targeted the remaining enemy positions on the south ridge. Elena watched through binoculars as secondary explosions indicated that the insurgents had been storing ammunition in their fighting positions. The blast was larger than expected, suggesting they had planned for an extended engagement. As the sound of the explosions faded, an unusual quiet settled over the canyon. Tank's team maintained their defensive positions, but the enemy fire had stopped completely. Elena scanned the ridgelines through her binoculars, looking for signs of movement. I've got survivors moving down the backside of the north ridge, Elena reported. Looks like 4 or 5 fighters. They're heading toward the wadi system, just like I predicted. Tank confirmed her sighting through his own optics. The remaining enemy fighters were indeed attempting to escape, moving quickly down the reverse slope of the ridge where they thought they would be safe from observation. Blackbird Flight, can you engage the fleeing fighters? Negative, Ground Team Alpha. We're Winchester on ordnance. Returning to base for rearm. Good hunting. Tank cursed as the aircraft departed. Without air support, the escaping insurgents would likely get away, and they'd be free to plan another ambush against future convoys. The mission called for establishing a secure route to the forward medical station, which meant eliminating threats in the area. Elena lowered her binoculars and looked at Tank. We can catch them if we move now. I know a route that will put us ahead of them at the Wadi Junction. Tank considered the proposal. Pursuing enemy fighters with a mixed team that included medical personnel was definitely not standard procedure. But Elena had already proven herself in combat, and letting the insurgents escape would compromise future missions in the area. Elena, I need you to level with me, Tank said. What's your real background? Your personnel file says you're a Navy nurse, but everything I've seen suggests otherwise. Elena checked her sidearm and looked toward the route she'd identified for intercepting the fleeing insurgents. I am a Navy nurse, but before that, I was a Marine-attached hospital corpsman with 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines. Did 2 combat deployments in Anbar Province. After my Marine time, I went to nursing school and transferred to Navy Medical. The combat training never goes away. Tank processed this information quickly. 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines had seen some of the heaviest fighting during the Iraq surge. If Elena had served with them as a corpsman, she would have extensive combat experience and advanced medical training. It explained her tactical knowledge and marksmanship skills. Why didn't this show up in your personnel file for this mission? Tank asked. Because my current assignment is as a nurse. The Navy doesn't always include previous service history in current job assignments. I requested this deployment because I knew my combat experience would be useful in establishing the forward medical station. Lieutenant Commander Mitchell's voice crackled over the radio. Ground Team Alpha, what's your status? We heard the airstrikes. Tank keyed his mic. Enemy positions neutralized, but we have fleeing fighters heading toward escape routes. Request permission to pursue. Negative on pursuit. Your mission is to protect the medical team and establish the forward station. Do not deviate from primary objectives. Tank looked at Elena, who was studying the enemy escape route with obvious frustration. He faced a command dilemma. Following orders meant letting dangerous insurgents escape to fight another day. But pursuing them would mean taking medical personnel into additional danger. Elena seemed to read his thoughts. Tank, if those fighters get away, they'll report our numbers, equipment, and tactics. They'll be back with a larger force, and they'll target the medical station specifically. We need to finish this now. Orders are orders, Tank replied. But Elena could hear the conflict in his voice. Orders are to establish and secure the medical station, Elena countered. That includes eliminating threats to its operation. Those fighters represent a direct threat to mission success. Tank realized that Elena was right from a tactical standpoint, but wrong from a procedural one. As a Navy SEAL, he was trained to think flexibly and adapt to changing situations. But he also had clear orders to protect the medical team. The solution came to him in a moment of tactical inspiration. Chun, Williams, Morrison, you escort the rest of the medical team to the forward station. Take the vehicles and proceed with the primary mission. Elena and I will pursue the fleeing fighters and eliminate the threat. Elena looked at him with surprise. Tank, you can't split your team. That leaves you undermanned for the pursuit. No, Tank said with growing confidence in his decision. It leaves me with exactly the right person for the job. You've proven you can operate in combat. If you're willing, I need you to function as part of my team for this mission. Elena considered the proposal. It would mean officially crossing the line from medical support to combat operations. But she could see that Tank was right. The escaping insurgents posed a significant threat to the mission and to future operations in the area. I'm in, Elena said. But I need a proper rifle and combat gear. Chin spoke up. Ma'am, you can have my backup M4 and load-bearing equipment. I'll stick with the M14. As the team quickly reorganized, Elena efficiently donned the combat gear that Chin provided. The familiar weight of tactical equipment felt natural on her shoulders, bringing back muscle memory from her Marine deployments. She checked the M4 rifle thoroughly, testing its function and examining the optics. Tank watched Elena transform once again. With proper combat equipment, she looked every bit the experienced operator that her background suggested. Her movements were efficient and professional, with none of the hesitation he'd expect from someone transitioning between medical and combat roles. Chun, you're in charge of the medical team, Tank instructed. Get them to the forward station and establish defensive positions. Radio check every 30 minutes. If you don't hear from Elena and me within 4 hours, contact base and request extraction. Roger that, boss. Stay safe out there. Tank and Elena gathered additional ammunition and equipment for their pursuit mission. Elena selected fragmentation grenades and smoke canisters to supplement her load, choices that demonstrated her understanding of small unit tactics. "How many fighters are we tracking?" Elena asked as she studied the terrain ahead of them. Initial count was 4 to 5 survivors from the airstrikes. They're moving fast, but they have to stick to the low ground to avoid observation. If we take the high route along this ridgeline, we can parallel their movement and get ahead of them at the Wadi Junction. Elena examined Tank's proposed route and nodded approvingly. "That's good tactical thinking. We'll have the high ground advantage and can control the choke point where the wadis converge. But we need to move fast. They've got about a 20-minute head start." The two began their pursuit, moving quickly along the rocky ridgeline while maintaining tactical spacing. Elena's movement was smooth and quiet, with the economical efficiency of someone who had covered similar terrain under fire. Tank found himself reassessing his initial impressions of her completely. "Elena," Tank said as they moved, "why didn't you mention your combat background during the mission briefing?" "Because I've learned that people hear what they expect to hear," Elena replied, scanning the terrain ahead as she spoke. "When they see a Navy nurse, they assume that's all I am. Sometimes it's easier to let people underestimate you until circumstances require otherwise." Tank understood the logic, but it also raised questions about military personnel practices and team integration. "It would have been useful to know we had additional combat experience on the team." "Would it?" Elena asked. "Or would you have spent the entire mission worrying about whether the nurse could handle herself in combat, instead of focusing on your primary objectives? Sometimes the best way to prove your capabilities is to demonstrate them when they're needed." As they reached a vantage point overlooking the Wadi system, Elena and Tank could see the fleeing insurgents below them. The enemy fighters were moving in a loose formation, clearly confident that they had escaped the immediate threat. They had weapons and equipment, suggesting they were experienced fighters rather than local recruits. "4 fighters confirmed," Elena whispered, studying them through her rifle optics. 2 with AK-47s, 1 with what looks like an RPG launcher, and 1 with a radio pack. The radio operator is probably their leader. Tank examined the enemy formation and the terrain. "We can set up an ambush at that bend in the wadi where they have to cross the open area. Standard L-shaped ambush with you on the long side, and me on the short side." Elena studied the proposed ambush site and shook her head. "Better if we reverse that. You take the long side for sustained fire, and I'll take the short side for precision shots. The radio operator and RPG gunner are priority targets. I can eliminate both of them before they can react or call for reinforcements." Tank looked at Elena with growing respect. Her tactical suggestions consistently demonstrated advanced combat knowledge and sound reasoning. She wasn't just following his lead. She was contributing equally to their mission planning. "Agreed," Tank said. "Let's move into position." The two operators moved carefully down the slope toward their ambush positions. Elena's movement was so quiet that Tank had to look back occasionally to confirm she was still following him. Her fieldcraft skills were clearly well-developed from extensive training and experience. As they settled into their final positions, Elena checked her rifle one more time and calculated ranges to the various points where the enemy would be most vulnerable. The familiar pre-combat calm descended over her as she prepared to engage targets that posed a direct threat to her fellow service members. "Ready," she whispered into her radio. Tank acknowledged and settled into his own firing position. In a few minutes, the fleeing insurgents would walk into a carefully planned ambush executed by 2 highly trained professionals. But this time, one of those professionals was someone he'd initially dismissed as just a nurse who needed protection. Elena smiled grimly as she settled her crosshairs on the approaching targets. Sometimes the best camouflage wasn't digital patterns or natural concealment. Sometimes it was simply letting people see what they expected to see until the moment came to reveal who you really were. Elena adjusted her grip on the M4 rifle and controlled her breathing as the insurgent fighters approached the kill zone. Through her rifle scope, she could clearly see the 4 enemy combatants moving confidently through the wadi, their weapons held casually as they believed they had successfully escaped the ambush site. The lead fighter carried an AK-47 and was scanning ahead, but His attention was focused on potential threats from the direction they had come from, not from the high ground where Elena and Tank had positioned themselves. The second fighter carried the radio equipment that would allow them to coordinate with other insurgent cells in the area. The third had an RPG launcher slung across his back along with his rifle, while the fourth fighter appeared to be the youngest of the group and kept looking nervously over his shoulder. Tank's voice came through Elena's earpiece in a barely audible whisper. Targets entering kill zone in 30 seconds. Radio operator is your priority target. RPG gunner is secondary. I'll take the lead and trail fighters. Elena acknowledged with a soft click of her radio transmit button. She settled her crosshairs on the radio operator, a bearded man in his 30s who moved with the confidence of someone who had survived multiple engagements. Through her scope, she could see the antenna extending from his radio pack and the additional equipment that marked him as a key leader. The fighters entered the most vulnerable part of the wadi, where the terrain forced them to cross an open area with minimal cover. Elena's training took over as she applied steady pressure to her trigger, waiting for the perfect moment when all targets would be exposed simultaneously. Execute, Tank whispered. Elena's rifle cracked twice in rapid succession. Her first shot struck the radio operator's center mass, dropping him instantly before he could transmit any warning to other insurgent forces. Her second shot took down the RPG gunner, who was beginning to unsling his weapon when he heard the first shot. Tank's M4 rifle joined the engagement with controlled bursts that eliminated the remaining two fighters before they could effectively return fire or seek cover. The entire ambush lasted less than 10 seconds, with all four insurgents neutralized before they could pose any threat to American forces or report the convoy's location and capabilities. Elena maintained her sight picture for several seconds after the shooting stopped, scanning for additional threats and ensuring that all targets were down. Her combat experience had taught her that wounded enemies could still be dangerous, and she wanted to confirm that the threat was completely eliminated. All targets down, Elena reported calmly. No movement detected. Tank acknowledged and began moving toward the enemy positions to conduct battle damage assessment and search for intelligence materials. Elena provided overwatch, keeping her rifle trained on the area while Tank checked each insurgent fighter. Radio equipment is destroyed, Tank reported as he examined the communications gear. Found cell phone, maps, and what looks like operational planning documents. This was definitely an organized cell, not just random fighters. Elena studied the documents that Tank retrieved. The papers included hand-drawn maps of the area showing multiple positions for potential ambush sites, indicating that the morning's attack had been part of a larger operational plan. There were also photographs of American vehicles and equipment, suggesting that the insurgents had been conducting surveillance on coalition forces for some time. Tank, look at this, Elena said, pointing to one of the maps. They've marked the location where we're supposed to establish the forward medical station. This wasn't a random ambush. They specifically targeted our convoy because they knew about the mission. Tank examined the intelligence materials more carefully and reached the same conclusion. The level of detail in the enemy planning indicated that they had prior knowledge of the convoy's route, timing, and objectives. This meant there was either a security leak in the mission planning process or the insurgents had developed sophisticated surveillance capabilities in the area. We need to get this intelligence back to base immediately, Tank said. If they know about the medical station, they're probably planning follow-up attacks. Elena nodded and began collecting additional evidence from the scene. Her medical training gave her a systematic approach to documentation that complemented Tank's tactical focus. Together, they efficiently gathered everything that might provide useful intelligence about insurgent operations in the region. Tank's radio crackled with an update from Chun. Boss, we've reached the forward station site. Area appears secure, but we found evidence of recent enemy observation. Looks like they've been watching this location for several days. Copy that, Tank responded. We've eliminated the immediate threat and recovered intelligence indicating extensive enemy surveillance of the mission. Continue establishing defensive positions. Elena and I are moving to your location. As they prepared to leave the ambush site, Elena took a moment to reflect on what had just occurred. In the space of a few hours, she had transitioned from being perceived as a protected non-combatant to functioning as an equal partner in a combat operation. The experience was both familiar and strange. Familiar because it brought back the intense focus and teamwork she remembered from her Marine deployments, but strange because it highlighted how much her role had changed since becoming a nurse. "Elena," Tank said as they began moving toward the forward station, "I owe you an apology. I made assumptions about your capabilities based on your current assignment instead of looking at your full background and qualifications." Elena adjusted her equipment and began walking alongside Tank. "No apology necessary. Your assumptions were reasonable based on the information you had. Most nurses don't have combat experience, and most medical personnel assigned to these missions are there strictly for medical support. But you're not most medical personnel," Tank observed. "Your combat skills are as sharp as anyone on my team. Why did you transition from Marine combat operations to Navy nursing?" Elena considered the question as they moved through the rocky terrain. "I loved being a corpsman with the Marines, but I wanted to expand my medical knowledge and capabilities. Becoming a nurse opened up opportunities for advanced training in trauma care, surgical assistance, and medical management. I thought my combat days were over when I made the transition." "What changed your mind about this deployment?" "I heard about the mission requirements and realized that my combination of combat experience and advanced medical training might be exactly what was needed. Forward medical stations in hostile territory require people who can function in both roles when circumstances require it." Tank processed this information as they climbed a rocky slope overlooking the forward station site. "The Navy personnel system should have flagged your combat background for this mission. Someone in planning dropped the ball by not identifying your full capabilities." Elena smiled grimly. "Actually, I think someone in planning knew exactly what they were doing. My orders came directly from Navy Medical Command with specific instructions to deploy as a nurse, but be prepared to utilize any additional skills as required by operational circumstances. I think they deliberately kept my combat background quiet to avoid complications during mission planning." Tank stopped walking and stared at Elena. "You're saying this was intentional? That Navy Medical Command specifically sent you on this mission knowing you had combat experience, but without telling my team?" "That's my assessment," Elena confirmed. "Think about it. Forward medical stations in hostile territory have unique requirements. You need medical personnel who can function in combat environments, but you also need plausible deniability if questions arise about putting medical staff in combat roles. By sending a nurse who happens to have extensive combat experience, they created a flexible capability without officially violating medical personnel policies." Tank shook his head in amazement. Military bureaucracy could be incredibly complex, but this level of subtle maneuvering was impressive even by Pentagon standards. Someone high up in the command structure had engineered a creative solution to a difficult personnel problem. "So what happens now?" Tank asked. "Do you go back to being just a nurse once we establish the medical station?" Elena looked toward the site where Chun and the other team members were setting up defensive positions. "That depends on what the mission requires. I'm qualified to function in either role, and I'll do whatever is most needed to ensure mission success." As they approached the forward station site, Tank could see that his team had made good progress in establishing a defensive perimeter. The other medical personnel were setting up their equipment under Chin's protective supervision, while Williams and Morrison had established observation posts on the high ground overlooking the area. Chun spotted Tank and Elena approaching and called out a situation report. "Perimeter secure, medical equipment deployed, and defensive positions established. The other medical personnel are asking about the gunfire they heard, and Lieutenant Commander Mitchell has been calling for updates." Tank looked at Elena one more time before rejoining his team. The morning's events had fundamentally changed his understanding of military medical support and the capabilities of personnel who might appear to be non-combatants. Elena had proven herself to be a valuable combat asset while maintaining her primary medical qualifications. "Elena," Tank said, "when we debrief this mission, I'm going to recommend that your full qualifications be clearly identified in all future assignments. Teams need to know what capabilities they have available." Elena nodded her agreement. "Just make sure the recommendation includes both my medical and combat qualifications." The goal isn't to turn me into a full-time operator. It's to maximize the utility of cross-trained personnel in complex operational environments. As they entered the forward station perimeter, Tank reflected on the lessons learned during their mission. The most important insight wasn't about tactics or enemy capabilities. It was about the danger of making assumptions about people's abilities based on their apparent roles or current assignments. Elena had demonstrated that the most effective military professionals were often those who defied easy categorization, bringing unexpected combinations of skills that could prove decisive in complex operational situations. Her ability to function seamlessly in both medical and combat roles had been the key to their mission's success. Tank decided that in future operations, he would pay much closer attention to the full background and capabilities of every team member, regardless of their primary assignment. Elena had taught him that sometimes the most valuable assets were hiding in plain sight, waiting for the right circumstances to reveal their true potential. The forward medical station was now operational. The immediate threats had been eliminated, and valuable intelligence had been gathered about enemy capabilities in the area. But, perhaps most importantly, Tank's SEAL team had gained a new understanding of how effectively cross-trained personnel could enhance mission capabilities when properly integrated into operational planning. Elena began setting up her medical equipment alongside the other nurses, transitioning smoothly back to her primary role while remaining ready to resume combat operations if circumstances required. She had proven that the artificial boundaries between medical and combat personnel could be successfully crossed when missions demanded flexible responses to unexpected challenges. The mission was far from over, but the foundation for success had been established through teamwork that transcended traditional role definitions and assumptions about capability limitations. 3 days after the initial ambush, the forward medical station had become a critical hub of activity in the remote Afghan valley. Elena moved efficiently between patient treatment areas, coordinating care for wounded coalition forces who were brought in by helicopter from various operations throughout the region. The station's success had exceeded all expectations. In 72 hours, Elena and her medical team had treated over 40 patients, ranging from minor injuries to critical trauma cases. The combination of advanced medical capabilities and secure positioning had made the station invaluable for extending coalition operational reach into previously contested territory. Tank observed Elena's work with growing respect. Her medical skills were every bit as impressive as her combat abilities. She moved between patients with calm efficiency, making rapid diagnoses and treatment decisions that consistently proved correct. The other medical personnel clearly looked to her for leadership, despite the fact that she wasn't formally in charge of the medical team. But Tank also noticed that Elena maintained constant awareness of the tactical situation around the medical station. While treating patients, she kept track of defensive positions, monitored radio communications, and observed the surrounding terrain for potential threats. Her ability to function simultaneously in medical and security roles had proven essential to the station's success. Lieutenant Commander Mitchell arrived at the station on the 3rd day to conduct a mission assessment and receive briefings on the intelligence gathered from the ambush. She found Tank and Elena reviewing defensive positions together, with Elena offering suggestions for improving fields of fire and observation posts. Petty Officer Vasquez, Lieutenant Commander Mitchell said, approaching Elena with obvious curiosity. I've been reading the after-action reports from your convoy mission. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez has provided some very interesting details about your performance during the ambush. Elena set down the tactical map she'd been studying and faced her superior officer. Ma'am, I performed my duties as required by operational circumstances. According to the report, you eliminated 3 enemy fighters with precision rifle fire at extended range, then participated in a pursuit operation that resulted in the destruction of an enemy cell and the recovery of valuable intelligence. This goes significantly beyond standard medical personnel duties. Tank stepped forward to support Elena. Ma'am, Petty Officer Vasquez's actions were essential to mission success. Without her tactical contributions, we would have sustained casualties and failed to eliminate the threat to this station. Lieutenant Commander Mitchell studied Elena carefully. Petty Officer, Your personnel file shows you as a qualified nurse with no mention of combat training or experience. How do you explain the discrepancy between your recorded qualifications and your demonstrated capabilities? Elena exchanged a quick glance with Tank before responding. Ma'am, my file reflects my current assignment and primary qualifications. My previous service history with Marine units included extensive combat training, but that background wasn't considered relevant to my nursing assignment. Previous service with Marine units? Lieutenant Commander Mitchell asked with raised eyebrows. What specific units and deployments? 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines, ma'am. 2 combat deployments to Anbar Province as an attached hospital corpsman. Advanced combat training graduate, expert marksman qualification, and completion of Marine Corps squad-level tactics courses. Lieutenant Commander Mitchell processed this information with obvious surprise. Petty officer, that level of combat experience should have been clearly identified in your mission assignment. Why wasn't I informed of your background? Elena hesitated, unsure how much of her speculation about Navy Medical Command's intentions she should share. Tank recognized her dilemma and decided to provide support. Ma'am, Tank interjected, I believe Petty Officer Vasquez's assignment was specifically designed to provide the mission with flexible capabilities. Her combination of advanced medical training and extensive combat experience makes her uniquely qualified for forward station operations in hostile territory. Lieutenant Commander Mitchell looked between Tank and Elena, clearly trying to understand the full situation. Are you suggesting that Navy Medical Command deliberately concealed Petty Officer Vasquez's combat qualifications during mission planning? I'm suggesting that they provided exactly the right person for this mission, Tank replied diplomatically. The question is whether we take advantage of her full capabilities or limit her to strictly medical duties. Elena decided to address the question directly. Ma'am, I'm qualified and willing to function in whatever capacity best serves the mission. If you need me as a nurse, I'll focus on medical duties. If operational requirements demand additional capabilities, I'm prepared to provide them. Lieutenant Commander Mitchell studied the tactical map that Elena and Tank had been reviewing. The defensive improvements they'd planned showed sophisticated understanding of small unit tactics and defensive positioning. Elena's suggestions were clearly those of someone with extensive experience in establishing secure positions in hostile territory. The intelligence you recovered from the pursuit operation has been extremely valuable, Lieutenant Commander Mitchell said. It revealed an extensive network of enemy surveillance and planning that we hadn't detected through other means. Your tactical initiative prevented those fighters from reporting our capabilities and location to other insurgent cells. Elena nodded. The enemy planning documents suggested this was part of a larger operation. Have there been any follow-up threats to the station? Actually, yes. Intelligence reports indicate that insurgent forces are planning a coordinated attack on this position within the next 48 hours. The attack is expected to involve multiple cells with heavy weapons, possibly including mortars and recoilless rifles. Tank immediately shifted into operational planning mode. What's our reinforcement schedule? Will we have additional personnel and equipment before the attack? Negative. Higher command has determined that reinforcing this position would compromise other operations. You'll need to defend with current personnel and request air support as needed. Elena studied the tactical situation with growing concern. The current team consisted of Tank's 4 SEALs plus the 5 medical personnel. Against a coordinated attack with heavy weapons, they would be significantly outnumbered and outgunned. Ma'am, Elena said. With respect, defending this position with current manning levels will be extremely difficult. We should consider evacuating the medical station and relocating to a more defensible position. Lieutenant Commander Mitchell shook her head. Evacuation is not an option. This station has become critical to supporting operations throughout the region. Losing it would significantly reduce our capability to operate in this sector. Tank and Elena exchanged meaningful looks. They were being asked to defend an exposed position against superior enemy forces with minimal reinforcement. Success would require maximum utilization of all available resources and capabilities. Ma'am, Tank said carefully, if we're going to defend this position successfully, I need to use every asset available. That includes Petty Officer Vasquez's combat capabilities as well as her medical skills. Elena stepped forward. Ma'am, I request permission to function in a dual role during defensive operations. I can provide medical support during lull periods and combat support during active engagement. Lieutenant Commander Mitchell considered the request. Standard procedures called for medical personnel to remain in protected positions during combat operations. But the current situation was far from standard, and Elena's demonstrated combat capabilities could be crucial to mission success. Petty Officer Vasquez, if I authorize you to function in a combat role, you'll be taking risks that go beyond normal medical personnel assignments. Are you prepared for that responsibility? Yes, ma'am. I've operated in similar situations before, and I understand the risks involved. Lieutenant Commander Mitchell made her decision. Very well. For the duration of defensive operations, Petty Officer Vasquez is authorized to function in both medical and combat support roles as determined by operational requirements. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez will have tactical control during combat operations. Tank felt a sense of relief. Having Elena available as a combat asset would significantly improve their defensive capabilities. Her marksmanship skills and tactical knowledge could prove decisive in the coming engagement. Elena immediately began mental planning for the dual role she'd been assigned. She would need to position her medical equipment for rapid access while maintaining fighting positions that allowed her to contribute to the defensive effort. It was a complex challenge, but one she had experience managing from her Marine deployments. When do we expect the attack to begin? Elena asked. Intelligence suggests most likely timing is dawn tomorrow, Lieutenant Commander Mitchell replied. That gives you about 18 hours to prepare defensive positions and coordinate your response plan. Tank and Elena spent the rest of the day conducting detailed defensive planning. They positioned the other medical personnel in the most protected area of the compound, while establishing fighting positions that maximized fields of fire and mutual support. Elena's suggestions consistently demonstrated advanced tactical knowledge that complemented tank SEAL training. As evening approached, Elena found herself in the unusual position of simultaneously preparing medical supplies for treating casualties and checking weapons and ammunition for the upcoming battle. The duality felt natural to her. Both roles required the same attention to detail and preparation for high-stress situations. Tank approached her as she completed her preparations. Elena, I want you to know that having you as part of this team has changed everything about how I think about military medical support. You've proven that the artificial boundaries between medical and combat roles can be successfully bridged when missions require it. Elena looked around at the forward medical station they were preparing to defend. Tank, this mission has reminded me why I loved serving with Marine units. There's something powerful about being part of a team where everyone contributes their maximum capabilities regardless of their primary role designation. As darkness settled over the Afghan valley, Elena and Tank completed their final preparations for the coming battle. The forward medical station had become much more than a simple medical facility. It had evolved into a symbol of what could be accomplished when military professionals were allowed to utilize their full range of capabilities in service of mission success. Elena checked her rifle one final time and settled into her fighting position. Tomorrow would bring the ultimate test of whether their defensive preparations and integrated approach to medical and combat operations could withstand a determined enemy assault. But she felt confident that the team they had built could meet any challenge through the combination of professional competence, mutual respect, and the willingness to look beyond traditional role limitations. The nurse who had once been dismissed as a non-combatant was now an integral part of a defensive plan that could determine the success or failure of coalition operations throughout the region. Elena smiled grimly as she settled in to wait for dawn. Sometimes the best way to prove your worth was simply to be ready when the moment came to demonstrate who you really were beneath the surface assumptions others made about you.